very pleasantly. The ladies agreed that they would not dress, but of course they did so with more or less of care. Lizzie made herself to look very pretty, though the skirt of the gown in which she came down was that which she had worn during the journey. Pointing this out with very much triumph, she accused Mrs. Carbuncle and Lucinda of great treachery in that they had not adhered to any vestige of their travelling raiment. But the rancour was not vehement, and the evening was passed pleasantly. Lord George was infinitely petted by the three houris around him, and Lizzie called him a corsair to his face. "And you are the Medora," said Mrs. Carbuncle. "Oh, no, that's your place, certainly," said Lizzie. "What a pity Sir Griffin isn't here," said Mrs. Carbuncle, "that we might call him the Giaour." Lucinda shuddered without any attempt at concealing her shudder. "That's all very well, Lucinda, but I think Sir Griffin would make a very good Giaour." "Pray don't, aunt. Let one forget it all just for a moment." "I wonder what Sir Griffin would say if he was to hear this," said Lord George. Late in the evening Lord George strolled out, and of course the ladies discussed his character in his absence. Mrs. Carbuncle declared that he was the soul of honour. In regard to her own feeling for him, she averred that no woman had ever had a truer friend. Any other sentiment was of course out of the question, for was she not a married woman? Had it not been for that accident, Mrs. Carbuncle really thought that she could always have given her heart to Lord George. Lucinda declared that she always regarded him as a kind of supplementary father. "I suppose he's a year or two older than Sir Griffin," said Lizzie. "Lady Eustace, why should you make me unhappy?" said Lucinda. Then Mrs. Carbuncle explained that whereas Sir Griffin was not yet 30, Lord George was over 40. "All I can say is he doesn't look it," urged Lady Eustace enthusiastically. "Those sort of men never do," said Mrs. Carbuncle. Lord George, when he returned, was greeted with an allusion to angels' wings, and would have been a good deal spoiled among them were it in the nature of such an article to receive injury. As soon as the clock had struck 10, the ladies all went away to their beds. Lizzie, when she was in her own room, of course found her maid waiting for her. It was a necessary part of the religion for such a woman as Lizzie Eustace that she could not go to bed, or change her clothes, or get up in the morning without the assistance of her own young woman. She would not like to have it thought that she could stick a pin into her own belongings without such assistance. Nevertheless, it was often the case with her that she was anxious to get rid of her girls' attendance. It had been so on this morning, and before dinner, and so it now was again. She was secret in her movements, and always had some recess in her boxes and bags and dressing apparatus to which she did not choose that Miss Patience Crabstick should have access. She was careful about her letters, and very careful about her money. And then as to that iron box in which the diamonds were kept. Patience Crabstick had never yet seen the inside of it. Moreover, it may be said, either on Lizzie's behalf or to her discredit, as the reader may be pleased to take it, that she was quite able to dress herself, to brush her own hair, to take off her own clothes, and that she was not, either by nature or education, an incapable young woman. But that honour and glory demanded it. She would almost as lief have had no Patience Crabstick to pry into her own private matters, all which Crabstick knew, and would often declare her mistress to be of all mistresses the most slyest and least comatible. On this present night she was very soon dispatched to her own chamber. Lizzie, however, took one careful look at the iron box before the girl was sent away. Crabstick on this occasion had not far to go to seek her own couch. Alongside of Lizzie's larger chamber there was a small room, a dressing room with a bed in it, which for this night was devoted to Crabstick's accommodation. Of course she departed from attendance on her mistress by the door which opened from the one room to the other, but this had no sooner been closed than Crabstick descended to complete the amusements of the evening. Lizzie, when she was alone, bolted both the doors on the inside, and then quickly retired to rest. Some short prayer she said, and her knees close to the iron box. Then she put certain articles of property under the pillow, her watch and chain, and the rings from her fingers, and a packet which she had drawn from her travelling desk, and was soon in bed. Thinking that, as she fell away to sleep, she would revolve in her mind that question of the corsair. Would it be good to trust herself and all her belongings to one who might perhaps take her belongings away, but leave herself behind? The subject was not unpleasant, and while she was considering it, she fell asleep. It was perhaps about 2 a.m. when a man, very efficient at the trade which he was then following, knelt outside Lady Eustace's door, and with a delicately made saw, aided probably by some other equally well-finished tools, absolutely cut out that portion of the bedroom door on which the bolt was fastened. He must have known the spot exactly, for he did not doubt a moment as he commenced his work, and yet there was nothing on the exterior of the door to show where the bolt was placed. The bit was cut out without the slightest noise, and then when the door was opened, was placed just inside upon the floor. The man then, with perfectly noiseless step, entered the room, knelt again just where poor Lizzie had knelt as she said her prayers, so that he might the more easily raise the iron box without a struggle, and left the room with it in his arms, without disturbing the lovely sleeper. He then descended the stairs, passed into the coffee room at the bottom of them, and handed the box through an open window to a man who was crouching on the outside in the dark. He then followed the box, pulled down the window, put on a pair of boots which his friend had ready for him, and the two, after lingering a few moments in the shade of the dark wall, retreated with their prize round a corner. The night itself was almost pitch dark and very wet. It was as nearly black with darkness as a night can be. So far the enterprising adventurers had been successful, and we will now leave them in their chosen retreat, engaged on the longer operation of forcing open the iron safe. For it had been arranged between them that the iron safe should be opened then and there. Though the weight to him who had taken it out of Lizzie's room had not been oppressive, as it had oppressed the tall serving man, it might still have been an encumbrance to gentlemen intending to travel by railway with as little observation as possible. They were, however, well supplied with tools, and we will leave them at their work. On the next morning, Lizzie was awakened earlier than she had expected, and found not only Patience Crabstick in her bedroom, but also a chambermaid and the wife of the manager of the hotel. The story was soon told to her. Her room had been broken open, and her treasure was gone. The party had intended to breakfast at their leisure and proceed to London by a train leaving Carlisle in the middle of the day, but they were soon disturbed from their rest. Lady Eustace had hardly time to get her slippers on her feet and to wrap herself in her dressing gown, to get rid of her dishevelled nightcap and make herself just fit for public view, before the manager of the hotel and Lord George and the tall footman and the boots were in her bedroom. It was too plainly manifest to them all that the diamonds were gone. The superintendent of the Carlisle police was there almost as soon as the others, and following him very quickly came the important gentleman who was the head of the constabulary of the county. Lizzie, when she first heard the news, was awestruck, rather than outwardly demonstrative of grief. "There has been a regular plot," said Lord George. Captain Fitzmaurice, the gallant chief, nodded his head. "Plot enough," said the superintendent, who did not mean to confide his thoughts to any man, or to exempt any human being from his suspicion. The manager of the hotel was very angry, and at first did not restrain his anger. Did not everybody know that if articles of value were brought into a hotel, they should be handed over to the safe keeping of the manager? He almost seemed to think that Lizzie had stolen her own box of diamonds. "My dear fellow," said Lord George, "nobody is saying a word against you or your house." "No, my lord, but—" "Lady Eustace is not blaming you, and you do not blame anybody else," said Lord George. "Let the police do what is right." At last the men retreated, and Lizzie was left with Patience and Mrs. Carbuncle. But even then she did not give way to her grief, but sat upon the bed awestruck and mute. "Perhaps I had better get dressed," she said at last. "I feared how it might be," said Mrs. Carbuncle, holding Lizzie's hand affectionately. "Yes, you said so." "The prize was so great." "I was always a-telling my lady," began Crabstick. "Hold your tongue," said Lizzie angrily. "I suppose the police will do the best they can, Mrs. Carbuncle?" "Oh, yes, and so will Lord George." "I think I'll lie down again for a little while," said Lizzie. "I feel so sick I hardly know what to do. If I were to lie down for a little I should feel better." With much difficulty she got them both to leave her. Then, before she again undressed herself, she bolted the door that still had a bolt, and turned the lock on the other. Having done this, she took out from under her pillow the little parcel which had been in her desk, and untying it perceived that her dear diamond necklace was perfect, and quite safe. The enterprising adventurers had indeed stolen the iron case, but they had stolen nothing else. The reader must not suppose that